Hello everybody and welcome to the inaugural On the Learning Couch here in Western Australia. My name is Louise Kelly and it is my absolute privilege to welcome Professor Gary Martin, Executive Director and CEO of the Australian Institute of Management, Western Australia.
Thanks, Louise. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Gary. Your position at the Australian Institute of Management, you've been doing the role for the last 4 years. So in that time, we've had the mining boom and there's been a lot of changes recently in the market. What are some of the things that you could predict or see that are happening with the changes in the market in learning and development for learning practitioners? So some of the big changes at the moment.
Well, obviously the challenging economic environment's caused a number of issues, I think, for learning and development practitioners. For example, many of the companies that were really fostering their employees' growth or their people's growth have had to reduce learning and development across the organisation. And what that's actually meant is that for learning and development practitioners, there's also been less work as well. It's also a fact that the type of learning and development programs have changed. While it might be that there's been, in previous years, strong emphasis on leadership and management development, for example, that's tapered off a little bit. And what's important has been compliance type programs. So you see the type of training's changed along the way. It doesn't mean there's not learning and development type programs around leadership and management development, but they're more nice to have, which is actually quite ironic because during times of challenging economic times, you actually need stronger leadership and management within an organisation. It's also meant that learning and development professionals in Western Australia have had to become much more competitive in terms of their offering and have actually had to reduce the type of rate that they're working for if they're private consultants. What's happened in some organisations is in fact that there's been an increase in internal learning and development type specialists and coordination. And what that's also meant is that people who have been put into the roles are not necessarily the right people in all cases.
Okay. So there are a lot of changes that have been happening. I'm obviously in learning and development and I can see some of the things from my perspective. One of the reasons I asked you along, Gary, was because your perspective is very much more an umbrella view with where you see things. So compliance is on the rise, ghastly stuff, okay.
It's perhaps not on the rise, but it's something that hasn't been let go, whereas other things that might be perceived to be nice to have actually declined as learning and development budgets in organisations have been tapered back.
Gary, what would be the repercussions though if businesses stop investing in the learning and development, the professional development, or the things like leadership development, team building, those kind of internal processes that build or fortify an organisation? If they stop investing in that, what would be the repercussions in a few years' time?
Well, I'll just use another argument first of all. In cases of challenging economic times, a lot of organisations cut their marketing and their branding, right? And what that does is that it further pushes the business away because people aren't, or organisations aren't as known in the community. If you then switch over to learning and development and say, during challenging economic times, there should be a renewed focus on learning and development to drive productivity, to drive new strategic directions so that businesses can establish a sustainable future.
Yeah, because definitely during times of change, that's the time to be innovative and the time to be grabbing chances and opportunities and things that come your way. I know during the GFC, I found that in the marketplace, people were spending money on IT training. That continued to be invested in, but they actually dropped a lot of the professional development. And then a couple of years later, there were lots of issues in the workplace with conflict and stress leave and things like that. That's what I noticed last time it happened. Have you got any insight into that?
In terms of what the opportunities are for learning and development professionals at this particular time in Western Australia, there's a strong need as businesses try to reposition themselves to have learning and development practitioners who are skilled at facilitation, for example, to help organisations review their existing initiatives, to plan and then to evaluate those. So there's a lot of work around facilitation for organisations who are trying to develop a sustainable future. So that's really, really important type of piece of work that learning and development practitioners can engage in.
So with some of the processes that you're particularly focused on at the Australian Institute of Management Western Australia, I know that you have a really thorough mentoring program that you've set up. You're a big advocate of mentoring. How do you see that as something within your repertoire in learning and development, as something that can help a business? How does that fit?
Look, I'd like to comment on that a little bit later if I can, because I think the other things that learning and development professionals need to look at particularly if they're private or they're small companies, they actually need to convince organisations about the return on their investment when it comes to learning and development. And that's really important in Western Australia, to get something that is a major leadership development program or a major mentoring or coaching program. It's got to be clear to the organisation that this is really going to do something for the organisation, and what's the return on the investment. So if I'm spending $100,000, $200,000 on learning and development, what are the outcomes going to be? What am I going to get back? That's a really important focus. Learning and development practitioners need to move along those lines, not just to advocate a particular type of training, but also to think through and work through with an organisation what the outcomes might be.
I think that's quite hard to quantify and to give evidence of, though, especially for the independent consultants. I imagine bigger businesses are able to quantify those kind of return on investments a lot better. With WA being such a geographically remote place, I believe that it's described as one of the most remote cities in the world. What are some of the things that may be done different here in WA to eastern states, seeing as, the businesses that we're dealing with, a lot are run from eastern states, or we do a lot of trade with up in Asia. So what might be some of the major differences here in WA with the way things are done?
Yeah, I think the major one is that learning and development practitioners, particularly those that are involved in coordinating programs, have to be able to manage remotely, and they need systems and process to be able to manage learning and development programs remotely, because the workforce is spread. And we're not just talking about remotely in Western Australia, because many Western Australian companies have operations overseas, and that needs to be included in that remote management of learning and development programs. And there is going to be use of technology, obviously, in that. That's an important thing as we go through, so that if I'm in a training room or a session anywhere, it could be in Karrinyup that the focus is, where everyone's located. We should be able to work with Karratha at the same time, and at the same time as that, we should be able to use technology to deliver in Kuala Lumpur, so that all of the workforce is connected through information technology.
And with the developments in online learning, e-learning, remote learning, what are some of the things that have materialised in the last few years that you may have followed up or been interested in, and it might be of interest to some of the people looking at today, just to get them up to date with what is possible today, because every 6 months there's completely new things on the market.
I'd have to preface my comments by saying, first of all, I'm more of a fan of blended learning rather than online learning type programs. So online learning programs, I think, are good for compliance type training and factual learning and so on. But when you're talking about things like supervisory development, management development, I think educational technology enhances the outcomes of a program, but I think there's still nothing better than face-to-face type learning supported by blended learning. Now, blended learning itself is going to come with its challenges as well. We have frequently have people that or companies that want a blended learning approach because it seems the best way to operate, and it is great to be able to have people bring to a particular session knowledge and some skills and understanding, and then to work with those once you get into a face-to-face situation. That might be reading beforehand, might be doing online exercises beforehand and so on, and then coming in and applying some of that learning in a face-to-face situation. However, the challenge is to get people to engage with that stuff, if I can call it, which is because it's
hard.
A mixture before they actually come.
Yeah.
It poses a major challenge for learning and development practitioners when people come to class. Some people, or come to a session, some people have actually engaged with material before a session, and others haven't. And we see that quite regularly. So the learning and development practitioner has to be very skilled at being able to deal with multiple levels of understanding. You can't ever assume that everybody's coming to the room with the same level of understanding from the materials that they've looked at or the exercises that they've
Well, it's one thing
online.
to provide them with the materials, whether they look at it or engage with it is completely different, isn't it? And often people are hijacked into it, or they get told you're being sent on a course, and they almost see it as punishment.
Well, that's right. And there's a good chance that people that have not had an individualised approach and have been sent on something and they haven't necessarily agreed to it are not going to be as engaged as others who have selected to do something as well. I mean, that's just human nature.
There's definitely a barrier there.
There's another issue though that comes with more the online learning and self-directed and online learning, and also blended learning approaches, is that it assumes that all learners are very self-directed.
Oh, yeah, there is an assumption.
And there's an assumption that people can pick up and plan their time. There's to learn, plan the content that they want, identify their own needs. Now, some people are very, very, very good at that, and other people, because of their schooling, it's been very traditional and it's been more of a spoon-fed approach. They haven't had a chance to develop skills necessarily to be a self-directed learner. Now, I guess we're talking about those older in the workforce, because schools have changed now as well and promote more self-directed approach to learning. But there's still a very large number of people engaged in learning and development programs who are, say, my age, who came from a schooling background, and that schooling background was not about inquiry or self-direction. It was about pass through a series of exams and regurgitate the facts. So the whole learning agenda's
I've
changed.
noticed that with students from particular countries as well.
Sure.
They're very reluctant to say their point of view or share something because they expect it to come from the facilitator up there, and they don't like it's very much out their comfort zone. So there's cultural differences.
Yeah, there certainly can be cultural differences, but I'd hate to stereotype particular cultures, because in my experience I've found that students from a particular background, you'll still get those that want to shine and contribute, and those that don't, basically. But I have been aware of situations where people come to a particular situation and they don't want to contribute because they don't feel confident and they haven't seen it as their role. So again, that's all about a level of self-directedness of the learner.
Yeah. Can I ask you a little bit about your involvement with China?
Sure.
Gary, that would be good.
Well, we've set about at the Institute trying to develop the concept of global leadership.
Yeah.
And there is a real need to develop leaders in a global context. We considered ways in which we might go around that or achieve that. And what we found is, after looking at what was on the market in the learning and development space, a lot of the programs that were on offer were visits to a country, whirlwind tour, visit this, visit that. What we decided to do is, because of Western Australia's strong connections with China, we decided that we would take a different approach in developing global leadership and arrange for leaders to go to two cities in China,
Yeah.
but not just to go and visit Chinese organisations, but to go and visit Australians, businesses who
Excellent.
are established in China. So an Australian perspective on the issues, challenges and opportunities
Excellent, great.
was possible, and that certainly was a strong point. But also learning about Chinese culture at the same time, learning about some of the challenges in Chinese business and where the opportunities are, because there are so many opportunities in China, particularly aged care, health, food.
What kind of market are you talking about, Gary? Have you got any kind of idea of figures or numbers you might be?
No, the economy is huge. I couldn't give you numbers, but what we've tried to do is expose people to a network of Chinese links, so that if you wanted to progress an idea, you'd have people to go and see. So what I'm getting at with learning and development program, it's all well and good to sit in the classroom and to hear about what it's like to do business in China, but when you experience the business context, it's quite different, overwhelming.
Yeah.
Lots of issues pop out, lots of opportunities pop out, lots of challenges pop out in front of your eyes, and that's a true and deep learning experience.
Well, you've been honoured with a professorship at one of the, or two of the Chinese universities. Can you tell us a bit about that, Gary?
That was more about my contribution to education in forging links between Western Australia and Chinese universities. And so giving talks in those universities, helping other staff in the universities with approaches to learning and development. And so those professorships, one's an honorary professorship and one's an emeritus professorship, is all about recognition. It's the Chinese way of recognising my contribution.
Great, fantastic. Well, with all of that, trips to China and everything like that, are there any kind of tips that you could give any learning practitioners to do with having more involvement with the Chinese market? It seems particularly pertinent here in WA.
Sure. Look, there's a lot of learning and development opportunities overseas in places like China. However, before you even considered it, you'd need to go on, I won't say the AIMWA China Connect trip, but something like that, because you would be so out of your depth if you haven't been to China to understand how to get around. You are not going to get any learning and development opportunities unless you've got a network of people established. So the first thing is all about establishing a network of people who can support you. And for learning and development organisations and individuals, the best way is to form partnerships with others to get started.
Yeah, okay.
Rather than trying to establish yourself.
Could you maybe share one thing to do with a cross-cultural thing that would be really important to remember, particularly if you're meeting and greeting Chinese people? Anything that stands out for you?
Well, the main thing is to understand, well, one of the main things anyway, because there's a lot of main things, is to understand that business with Chinese company just doesn't happen like a click of fingers. Here, you know, you can meet a couple of times and a deal could be signed up. If you were actually trying to do that in a Chinese context, you would have to be prepared to spend a lot more time getting to know the people you're working with. A
slower involvement.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Build a relationship with them, so there's trust.
Yeah.
That might involve, you know, spending a lot of time together, eating out, talking a lot, having extended meetings. It's really important that the relationship is established before you even get to
so
talk about business.
There's a big planning in your calendar, like time out from anything to happen.
Absolutely.
That's got to be built in for anything.
But if you invest and you're successful, there'll be a lot of work because Chinese companies are very, very big. So if you are adopted by a Chinese company as a learning and development organisational practitioner, the relationship's good, there's trust, you understand the needs, then there will be a huge outcome for you.
Thank you. Gary, with some of the changes in equipment, resources, software, systems and things like that that have come on the market. What are some of the real success stories that you know of that are being used by learning practitioners? It could be equipment, it could be online devices, so some things that are really working, and maybe even some things that people should actually get rid of.
Sure. Look, there's a number of things in Western Australia, and I'll go back to the context that we're operating within, that learning and development professionals, practitioners need to think about. One of the first things that they need to think about in Western Australia is the type of learning now, because the learning landscape's changed. So, it's mainly about, when you say what's working, what's not, any learning and development professional has to actually rethink their own personal brand. What is it that they offer? What is it they say they are going to do? What is it they stand for? Because there's an extremely competitive market out there. So that's the first thing. You need to actually think about what you stand for. The second thing you're going to need to do to continue to work within the West Australian market is be more inventive about what you do. So a lot of organisations, not all, are looking at more cost-effective learning and development programs rather than stopping them altogether, and that might mean that you have to rethink how you get greater coverage within an organisation, for example through train-the-trainer type programs.
With champions and...
Correct, and so your whole focus might not be in front of a group of 30 or 20
You've got
people.
your master trainers trained up.
It might be mentoring those sorts of people. We've also seen learning become far more personalised, and as a result of that, the focus on things like mentoring and coaching are really important at this particular point in time. But again, not necessarily about a learning and development professional mentoring members of a workforce, but mentoring the mentors or coaching the coaches. Those sorts of programs are really important. The other thing we're seeing in West Australian organisations and others is the focus on sharing the results of learning, so sharing your work learning. So maybe 10 years ago, you might have gone on a course of some sort, and you went on the course and you try and apply the learning, but you'd rarely share it with other members of your team. So a focus on team learning, very, very important in most West Australian organisations that are adopting that teamwork type approach. So there's a number of different things that people need to do, and there are also a number of different markets that people can go into, because while we're all about mining and mining services, or we were all about it.
Or building,
or construction, there are some other industries where there's a strong need for learning and development initiatives.
Which industries are they?
Well, if you take the state government, for example, while people say the state government have cut back on training, all right, and that's a necessity if they're trying to manage limited resources. But the state government is a huge employer still, absolutely huge employer. So training doesn't disappear overnight. Learning and development is still going to operate there, but you need to combine that with inventive ways, cost-effective ways, and strategies to be able to go into government, state government, and tender for state government projects or work on small consultancies. The important thing here for organisations, for example, that are learning and development organisations offering services, is they act now, because elections are going to slow things down. The state election coming up in the near future, I don't know exactly when, is going to slow all of that activity down as government agencies...
And middle of the year is always slowed down anyway.
Yeah, it's worse in an election year because no new plans tend to move forward. So now's the time to act if you're interested in state government. If we then go to local government, for example, only a year or so ago we were talking about amalgamation of local government areas.
Everyone was scared.
And what that meant is local governments held right back on any learning and development initiatives. Now that is over, we've seen local governments try to innovate, try to do things more effectively, And there's a huge role for learning and development professionals in individual local government areas. I've never seen more work come out of local government areas, but again, cost effective, innovation, return on investment.
Yeah, the return on investment is a big thing.
All those things are very
I
important.
love that idea with the team learning, you know, not just sending people on a course, but actually asking them to then share it back in the workplace with their teammates. So I see that as a very collaborative team building exercise.
So how does your approach to learning and development actually allow for that, or if you're running a program in an organisation or for an organisation, how do you build those things in is one of the questions, or a couple of the questions that people need to ask. The other industries though, if you think about it, what's growing? Healthcare.
Oh.
People are always going to need hospitals.
Yeah.
They're always going to need medical treatment. There's a whole range of opportunities in that sector.
Yeah.
And then there's aged care as well, because aged care is also growing and blossoming. So there's training opportunities or learning and development opportunities there as well.
You suggested trying to be a specialist more in these areas or getting your name known. Have you got one last tip before we wrap up for any learning practitioners out there looking at this?
Look, I think what I said about rethink your own personal brand. What do you stand for? What can you do? How can you do it? And why can you do it? Are questions that all learning and development practitioners should be asking themselves as the market softens.
All right. Thank you very much, Gary
Pleasure.
Martin.
Thank you.
It's been lovely to talk to you today. So I'd like to thank Professor Gary Martin from Australian Institute of Management, Western Australia, for coming in today. And also I'd like to thank Central Institute of Technology for allowing us to use the studio here, and for all of their students who have helped out tonight. Thank you very much.